Let me introduce our panel following this. Feel free to step up to coffee and water there at the table while I introduce our three panelists for today. We have a continued discussion with the next panel for the next hour or so. First, we have Daniel Chow. He's the Frank E. and Virginia H. Basler Chair in Business Law at Ohio State University, Moritz College of Law. He's written several books, and they're on your program. We have James Gerber, whom I know many years ago from about 20 years, maybe 18 years ago, from the Association of Borderland Studies. He's a non-resident scholar here at the Center for the U.S. and Mexico. And he is a professor emeritus of economics at San Diego State University. And then we have Simon Lester, who is also a non-resident fellow at the Baker Institute International Economics Program and the co-founder of the trade law and policy websites worldtradelaw.net and the China Trade Monitor. They have an extensive curriculum. You can read a short bio in your program. And without further ado, let me welcome Dr. Chow, Dr. Gerber, and Dr. Lester to the table. The floor is yours, David. I guess we'll go 10, 12 minutes and then a conversation,
yes,
right?
I think the easiest way to do it is the obvious way, and that is I will just ask my colleagues, beginning on my immediate left, to speak for 10 or 12 minutes, and then we'll have audience questions and some discussion among the panelists and see how things go. So why don't you start out, Dan?
Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about the U.S. China commercial relationship, and I'll start by talking about the U.S. China economic and trade agreement that was signed on January 15th, 2020. So this agreement was signed by the United States and China as a way to suspend the trade war between the two countries. The United States had imposed punitive tariffs on essentially all imports from China, and China had retaliated by imposing similarly punitive tariffs on imports from the United States. But of course, the United States imports much more from China than China imports from the United States. And so, of course, China was really facing the effects of the U.S. tariffs. And so the agreement was an attempt to suspend this trade war. And in the agreement, China agreed to purchase $200 billion in U.S. goods and services, and also made some major concessions with respect to intellectual property. Now, this was an attempt by the United States to, on a bilateral basis, resolve a trade issue, as opposed to, say, for example, on a multilateral basis, that is by going through the WTO. So the United States could have, if it wanted to, it could have brought a case against China within the WTO, and it could have sought compensation, or it could have sought a trade remedy against China for what the United States claims are unfair trade practices. And if the United States had brought such a case, and the United States had been successful in bringing such a case, the United States might well have received then some form of trade remedy that would be the equivalent to $200 billion, which is what the United States was claiming that China had needed to purchase from the United States in order to remedy some of these unfair trade practices that China had imposed upon the United States over a number of years. The difference, however, between the two is actually very, very substantial. That by going through the bilateral channels and essentially forcing or imposing on China an obligation to purchase $200 billion in goods and services from the United States, the United States did a couple of things that I think are very harmful if you believe in the WTO, if you believe in the multilateral system, that were very harmful to the multilateral system. First of all, and most importantly, I think, by going against China in a unilateral, this is really I call it a bilateral transaction, but it was really unilateral because the United States essentially imposed a obligation on China under threat of course, additional tariffs. That is, the United States was actually going to increase the amount of the tariffs. The tariffs were already punitive by charging punitive amounts, but the United States was actually going to increase those amounts and make them even more punitive. So this was really not bilateral, it was really unilateral and was imposed on China by the United States. And that, in and of itself, is harmful because it shows that the United States simply decided to ignore and disregard a system that it itself set up about 50 to 70 years ago, in which these types of disputes could be resolved through a multilateral channel, that is through the GATT/WTO, and that would then have political support of all of the countries in the GATT/WTO. So that's one thing, that anytime you act unilaterally, you are acting on the basis of power, right? The United States has, of course, a huge economic power, and that's in and of itself fundamentally inconsistent with the multilateral trading system. The second part of this that I think is also very harmful is that the remedy, or that is the result of the unilateral actions by the United States, was to exact a $200 billion commitment from China that in itself is a violation of one of the most fundamental principles of the WTO, and prior to the WTO, really of the international commercial trading system, which is that obligation violates the most favored nation principle. Because what China is saying, and this again was imposed on China by the United States, is that we will offer to the United States a unique benefit that we're offering to nobody else. And as the unique benefit that we're offering only to the United States is that we will buy $200 billion of goods from the United States. Now, that violates this principle of most favored nation, because if China offers that benefit to the United States under the MFN principle, the most favored nation principle, China must offer the same opportunity to every other member of the WTO. Of course, that's impossible, right? But if you offer to the United States the unique and singular offer or obligation to purchase $200 billion in goods, of course, that deprives competitors to the United States from competing for those same $200 billion in goods and services. So, for example, the European Union has no obligation to get any part of that $200 billion which China has pledged to spend for goods and services from the United States. So that is what I mean when I say it violates the most favored nation principle, and it's against, by singling out the United States for a unique benefit that China will not extend to anybody else and will give nobody else the right to compete for those goods and services. Now, if, however, right, now this is what happened in the result of the agreement. If the United States had gone through the WTO dispute settlement system, however, and had gotten a remedy from the WTO dispute settlement body, giving the United States the equivalent of $200 billion in trade remedies, that would be an exception to the MFN principle, and that would be perfectly lawful. So my feeling about what the United States did with the U.S. Economic and trade agreement is, again, it depends on your perspective, but it was a unilateral exercise of power by the United States and harmful to the system in two ways. Number one, just acting unilaterally was harmful in rejecting the multilateral approach, and secondly, imposing a remedy that violates one of the most fundamental principles of the system. So that's, my take on the USMCA, and this is where I think currently the United States currently commercial relationship between the United States and China is to a large extent governed by this agreement, and then the consequences of this agreement moving forward, whether the United States will actually have a phase 2 of this agreement, because this is supposed to be phase 1, that seems to be doubtful, but that, I think, is currently the situation between the United States and China. And of course, I'll take questions as we go along.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be on a panel with my distinguished colleagues. I'm the economist on the panel, and so I want to talk a little bit about international trade from an economics perspective. But I want to make a couple of things clear. One is that this is not from a business perspective. It's from the perspective of the economy. So that means that we're looking at the overall welfare of a nation state, the U.S. in this case. And secondly, it may be, I don't know, it depends on how this comes out, but it may sound like I'm anti-trade. I'm not. I'm pro-trade. And I think that trade does contribute to an improvement in welfare, and that we should look for ways to expand trade. Okay, but there's two areas that I want to address. One is about the politics of trade, and the second is about trade deepening, how we deepen the trade agreements that we have, and what are the consequences of that. I think, partly I'm reacting to the workshop yesterday where we talked a lot about the USMCA and the legal provisions within it, and then also the WTO and the U.S. confrontation with China. We forget, I think, how political trade is. That trade, when I was listening to Marc in his very excellent presentation this morning talking about the growth of globalization in the post-World War II period, but part of that, a really important part of that, was Cold War politics. This was a support of trading relations as a part of U.S. strategy for containing the Soviet Union. That was a really important part of it. Throughout the 1990s and the post-Soviet era, we thought, we sort of told ourselves this story, which turned out not to be true, that we had reached the end of history, and that we were now in this kind of linear ascent into a liberal, capitalist, democratic global system. And we sort of lived under that illusion for a long time. But at the same time, we were signing RTAs up and through the Obama administration, regional trade agreements. These regional trade agreements, if you look at them, are political agreements. So where do we have regional trade agreements? Let's begin with that. We have them in the Far East with our key military allies. We have them in Latin America, for example, with the Pacific Alliance, which consists of Chile and Peru and Colombia and Mexico, as part of an alliance against the spread of Chavismo, the Hugo Chavez system or the Correa system, or these other kind of resource nationalist, populist, anti-trade systems. We also have regional trade agreements with selected countries in the Middle East. Again, key military allies in the Middle East. So the trade the agreements that we've been signing are a really important part of our geopolitical military strategy in the world. The agreement with Mexico, I would argue, is a little bit different, but we signed that, remember, you all remember this, in the 1990s when we were hopeful that it would cement a set of liberal market openings in the Mexican economy and prevent a return to the kind of inward-looking statist policies that Mexico had followed in most of the post-World War II period up until that point. So when we then turn to a question such as Daniel was just addressing, what about China? And the moral panic we feel about China, which is really reminiscent of the same way that we reacted to Japanese ascendancy in the 1960s and 1970s, and before that, the Soviet ascendancy in the 1940s and 50s. There's a really strong component. The problem here is that the traditional narrative is completely broken down at this point, right? We have now reached a point where the traditional ideas that we've promulgated about trade and the benefits of trade have disappeared in many respects. So it's not clear really where we stand, right? We're unable to sign any new trade agreements. We're unable to get the WTO to function as we hoped that it would. There's a really strong populist movement in the U.S. that is completely opposed to increased market openings, right? So where do we stand in this period now? I think the politics is completely confused, and so as a consequence, our trade policies are completely confused. This brings me to this issue, the second issue then, which is this issue of trade deepening. How do we deepen trade relations? And I want to make a really key point, which I think is often overlooked in the discussion of trade, and that is that we have completely oversold the importance of trade. I'm not saying it's unimportant. This is where I'm a little bit fearful you're going to think I'm anti-trade. I'm not. I'm just saying we have painted a picture of trade as a solution to problems of economic development, as absolutely fundamental to being part of the first world and having high incomes. That's not necessarily the case, particularly anymore at this point. Some of the conflict that we face in places like the WTO is related to the fact that high-income countries like Western Europe and the United States and Japan have gotten most of the gains we're going to get out of trade. It's going to be really hard to squeeze any further gains out of trade. And the reason is because we've brought down most of our trade barriers. That is, the overt barriers, the barriers at the border, what economists would call the shallow integration of dropping your tariffs and getting rid of your quotas. We've done that, except for in a few selected sectors which are not that important to the national economy, right? So the U.S. economy is open. It's pretty open. If we open it a little bit more, what's going to be the benefit for the national economy? Yeah, not much. This is reflected, for example, in the estimates by the International Trade Administration of the benefits of the USMCA, which with a little bit of fudging of numbers, in my view, they were finally able to demonstrate that there would be a 0.35%, that is 1/3 of 1% increase in GDP over the next 5 to 10 years as a result of the USMCA, and that depended upon it being completely enforced and all of the uncertainty disappearing, right? That's not a big impact. That's really not a very big impact, right? So we're at a point where if we're going to deepen anymore, we're now going to have to address issues which are extremely contentious, because we're not talking about tariffs and we're not talking about quotas, right? We're talking about domestic policies that have an unintended effect on reducing the amount of trade that occurs. And that means things like labor market policies, environmental policies, competition policies, and so forth. These reach down into the domestic economy in a way which is disturbing to a lot of people. It's difficult to do. And even if it's not disturbing, politically, it's so difficult to do that, right? So I think we've oversold trade also just in the context of the USMCA. And Mexico's participation, Mexico sort of presented the NAFTA as a way in which it was going to join the first world, and it was going to suddenly be a developed economy once it signed the free trade agreement and all of that. I mean, this is part of how we've oversold this. Okay, so where might we go? Well, I think the only place left to really liberalize is services trade. And again, this is going to be, it has proven to be quite difficult to liberalize services trade. It's complicated, and there are a lot of entrenched interests that are not particularly interested in opening their markets to foreign competition. So we'll see where that goes. But going back to the previous point about overselling trade, it's not clear what the gains would be The data is really not very clear that there are huge, big gains to be had in that area. There are a bunch of issues on the table that we could negotiate, things like, where data is stored, the use of international payments with credit cards for e-commerce. There's a number of issues like that would benefit individual companies or perhaps even a sector of the economy, but impacts on large enough to affect GDP, I'm skeptical. Maybe, but I'm very skeptical. I'd have to see the numbers on that. What this all tells me is that we need to just relax. It's all okay. It doesn't, if we can't get the WTO working, well, okay, maybe we'll keep trying, and because it does do some good things, I think, and we want it around, but it's not that big a deal, perhaps, at least for us Americans. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. This is my first event as the non-resident fellow at the Baker Institute. Happy to be here. Thanks to the Baker Institute for having me. I'm going to focus my remarks on the World Trade Organization and the calls for reform. Almost since its inception, the WTO has been the subject of criticism and calls for reform. It had perhaps a few years of a honeymoon when it was created in 1995, but since then, there's been a lot of complaining about its shortcomings. And what I'm going to do today is talk about what I think are some of the biggest problems and what might be some practical solutions. And I'll give you a spoiler in advance. I don't think clever technical fixes are enough here. This is mostly a question of political will in the United States and other countries, and I'm not sure that political will exists right now, unfortunately. Before I get to the WTO's problems, though, let me say some things to mitigate the concerns that people might have about the WTO, and I pretty much agree with what you just said there, Jim. Because in some ways, I don't think the problems are as big as people suggest. Let me make 4 points here. So first is, the WTO was created in 1995 as part of the Uruguay round of trade negotiations. It took the existing GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and added an institution. It added new substantive obligations on intellectual property and services, among other things. And it created a more enforceable dispute settlement system, and we'll get to the problems with that in a minute. That was a big deal. A lot was done there. And so, to me, taking time to refine that, to consolidate those gains, seems pretty reasonable, and expecting a new equivalent of the Uruguay round negotiations every few years is not reasonable. So to some extent, we should be celebrating what we have, not complaining about what we don't. Second point is that some parts of the WTO still work pretty well, and it's under the radar. It's not well known, but there are a wide range of WTO committees where governments get together and talk about issues related to domestic regulation or intellectual property or anti-dumping and countervailing duty measures. And this is valuable work. It's a way to get at trade conflicts, to prevent them from spiraling into actual disputes. Just to have everybody, have a place where everyone can sit down and talk about these issues is useful, it is productive, and it happens every day, even if it doesn't make headlines. Third point, some people seem upset that the WTO isn't solving all the world's problems. So there are people saying, well, what can the WTO do about climate change? What can it do about COVID? And calling it irrelevant if it can't do anything. And I think that's just asking too much. It's not realistic or even necessarily desirable for the WTO to do all of these things. So I don't think this criticism is justified. And then finally, I think it's worth pointing out, because I see misunderstandings of this in the media all the time. The WTO is a member-driven organization. What that means is there are 164 member governments. They are the ones who make decisions here. And there's a tendency among some people to blame the WTO as if, the 600 staff of the WTO in Geneva are the decision makers here, and they're the problem. It's just important to point out, and just given the opportunity to point this out, that it's the governments really. If you have a complaint about the WTO, it's really your own government that you should talk to, because they're the ones driving things here. So, having said all of that, there are some real problems with the WTO right now. I'm going to put forward a few of them and offer some suggestions for possible improvement. So the first one is that new trade deals aren't being negotiated at the WTO. So as I said, the Uruguay round was a big deal. We haven't seen too many deals since then. Now, there it's not like there's been nothing going on. There are things that you could point to. There's something called the Trade Facilitation Agreement. There are sort of minor decisions that the WTO, through its members, has agreed to over time. But for the most part, there haven't been those big new deals. And as a result, as we've heard from Jim, from Mark, the trade negotiation action has shifted to bilateral and regional trade agreements. And yes, economists don't like these. As a undergrad economics major, I don't like them either. They're less desirable in terms of economic efficiency. We prefer to have things done on a multilateral basis. Can anything be done about this? About getting the WTO negotiating deals again? Maybe not. With 164 countries, more and more of them large economies who are assertive in trade affairs. It's very difficult to bring that many countries with that many different interests together and get a deal done. So what is the answer to this? Well, the best one is probably something called plurilateral deals, and it's a terrible word. And when an editor once wrote "ugh" next to it when I put it in a paper, but I mean that's what people refer to. Plurilateral deals meaning subject-specific agreements that move ahead with those who are willing. So at the WTO right now, there are discussions on a plurilateral basis. It's a hard word to say, of fishery subsidies, so reining in the subsidies that some governments give to the fishing sector. There have been talks about lowering tariffs on environmental goods. There have been talks about rules on digital trade. Even this won't be easy, but it's certainly easier than trying to get everyone on board. And there are some governments who object to the concept itself, that they say, well, the WTO isn't, the framework doesn't allow for plurilateral deals. But if enough governments want to go forward, they can do it either at the WTO or outside the WTO, which they've done in regional trade agreements. So the answer to the WTO can't negotiate full-fledged multilateral deals is some subset of members on a plurilateral basis can go ahead. Second criticism, second problem with the WTO, sort of building off this idea of all these bilateral regional trade agreements, is the system, because of all these bilateral and regional trade deals, the system has fragmented, undermining the WTO's role here. We no longer have a coherent trading system. We have this mess of rules that overlap and conflict and make trade more complicated. So what do we do about that? At the WTO, the WTO currently has a role in overseeing these bilateral and regional trade agreements. All of them get notified to the WTO. All of them get discussed at the WTO. What we don't have, and I'm not suggesting we should have this, what we don't have, in theory, the WTO is supposed to be making a decision on whether each bilateral and regional trade agreement is consistent with WTO rules. That hasn't happened, and I don't expect that to happen. But what I think could happen, because it's difficult when you're following WTO issues, it's pretty easy because the WTO is an organization that gathers all the documents, all the information together in one place. And so if you're an observer, a trade professional, whoever you are, if you want to follow it, you have a place to go. In contrast to that, with these bilateral and regional trade agreements, it's really difficult to get information on exactly what's happening. You can try on an agreement by agreement basis to go to the government's website, the governments who are part of this deal, and see what they say about it, and they don't say much. So my suggestion here has been let's have the WTO play a bigger oversight role to sort of gather together all of the issues that are being discussed, all the documents, put them on the WTO website, which is already set up for this, to provide, the WTO can provide meeting space for governments to sit down and sort of negotiate these agreements and update these agreements when they need updating, and to handle disputes about these agreements as well. So that was sort of a practical suggestion that I've had for how the WTO can sort of claw back some of the power that it's lost over the years to these bilateral and regional trade agreements. The final issue I'll mention is the enforceability of WTO rules. The WTO's dispute settlement system was referred to as the jewel in the crown of the WTO when it was created, and got a lot of praise at first. But over time, it has deteriorated to a significant extent, and mainly because of objections from the United States. So we are in a situation now. So what you have at the WTO is basically, if one government files a complaint against another, it goes to a panel, 3-person panel of experts, trade lawyers, diplomats, academics, and they issue a ruling on whether the challenged measure is in compliance with the rules. And what the Uruguay round added to this was an appeals court called the appellate body to review the panel, sort of like the Supreme Court of International Trade, although nobody wants to use the word court, so I shouldn't use the word court. And in its early years, the appellate body got a lot of praise from various circles, from academics, from the United States. They thought it sort of brought coherence and order to some of the decision making. The panels under the GATT had been inconsistent, had issued rulings that were inconsistent with each other. It was good to have this appellate body here overseeing things, and the United States, in some early cases, was pretty happy with the results. But over time, more and more complaints were brought against the United States. And the United States lost some of these, and they got very upset about it. And during the Obama administration, there were objections to specific judges on the appellate body. You see, the United States would object to one, but it would agree to appoint another. The Trump administration was so upset that they said no more appointments to the appellate body. And generally speaking, decisions at the WTO have to be made by consensus. So if the United States objects to the appointment of a particular appellate body member or any appellate body member, well, then there's no appointment to be made. And so we eventually got to the point where there's no appellate body. And so we have a dispute settlement system that, for the most part, isn't functioning. There are still cases going through the pipeline, and there are some cases where the governments have acted in good faith and said, look, we know there's no appellate body, so there's this panel report out here. We accept the result. We'll let it be adopted. We won't appeal it. In most cases, though, governments who have a complaint brought against them have appealed, as it said, into the void. So it's appealed, the case is just in limbo. So that has made the system pretty much unworkable at the moment. And the Europeans have proposed workarounds, and we're about to try. There's an appeal that's just been made through the Europeans' workaround, and we'll see how that goes. But what we really need is to get the United States on board to agree to some form of dispute settlement that works. Now, in the USMCA context, we sort of went the opposite way. In the NAFTA, dispute settlement broke down, and as part of the renegotiation, through pressure from Canada and Mexico and some Democrats in Congress, the Trump administration actually agreed to fix dispute settlement, and we now, for the moment, have USMCA, state-to-state dispute settlement on trade issues that works. So I think there is an argument that the Biden administration is not, in principle, against all forms of enforceable trade dispute settlement, but we don't know yet at the WTO what they would accept, and they haven't said anything. In the past couple weeks, the U.S. ambassador to the WTO has just been put in place, so perhaps now we're getting to the stage where we're getting to the point where actual negotiations could happen and the U.S. would engage constructively, and maybe we can find a solution. If I'm feeling on my optimistic days, I would say yes, that's where we're headed. On my pessimistic days, I say no, it's all over. The U.S. is not going to engage constructively. We have to wait for another administration. It just depends on my mood and what article I read about it, that particular day. So let me stop there, and happy to have further discussions.
If we could start. If the gentleman over here could repeat the question that you had, I think Simon probably can answer it for you.
Well, you basically answered the question, but it seems that the WTO has been faithless or appeal things. It takes an inordinate amount of time to get an answer, and whether or not whatever has been suggested by the WTO as a curative measure is not being followed by the states that are part of it. So it appears that, as you're pointing out, it becomes a more state-to-state way to solve things versus going through international basis.
Yeah. I mean, so I have a short paper I wrote a couple years ago saying basically WTO disputes should work more quickly, and here are some suggestions for how to do it. So certainly just speeding up the process would help, but then it has to actually function. It has to work. You have to actually be able to get a decision that people follow. I mean, I will say that there are many governments who still participate. So we recently just had a complaint brought by Mexico against Costa Rica. Costa Rica had restrictions on imports of avocados, and there was some there was a concern about a particular virus affecting their avocados, but everybody recognized that this was actually a protectionist measure. So after about 2 years, you do get a panel report saying Costa Rica is in violation of the rules, and so this was a situation where Costa Rica could have appealed it into the void, as I said, but they have decided not to. They're going to accept the panel report, and it looks like they're going to comply. So you still do have governments who act in good faith and comply with these things. It's mainly the United States who's been a problem, and it's also been a few other governments who, when confronted with a decision against them and the opportunity to appeal into the void and put it into limbo, haven't been able to resist that. So I won't say it's completely I wouldn't say it's completely feckless. I would say it works occasionally, and there are many governments who want to make it fully functional again. And the big question is, will the United States get on board with that?
Okay. We have several other questions, and I have one that I'll follow up with in a minute, but please go ahead.
This is a very simple question, perhaps one that everyone knows but and that is, as an example, in the case of the Costa Rica matter that you just mentioned, in addition to their agreement to comply, is there some penalty for not having complied, or is this one of these, oh, well, nothing's going to happen, I'll just have to do what I should have done in the first place?
So here's the way it works. When you have this decision that went against you and gets adopted by the dispute settlement body, so it's sort of a formal, rubber stamp process. But so once you have the panel report, it's going to get adopted if it's not appealed. And so at that point, you get a reasonable period of time to comply. And that can either be decided by arbitration or by agreement between the parties. So it's usually, let's say, around 12 months. So let's say you have a year now to comply. Okay. So ideally, everyone just complies and everyone's happy. If you don't comply, so if Costa Rica hasn't done anything after that year, Mexico can then file sort of a follow-up complaint saying, hey, Costa Rica, you were supposed to comply, you didn't. And sometimes the government will take an action where there's a dispute over compliance, whether it actually complies. You have to go to another panel. But let's put that aside. If we know for sure that Costa Rica didn't comply, then Mexico can request authorization to retaliate, for example, through imposing tariffs on Costa Rican products. And that is supposed to be an inducement for Costa Rica to comply. If you don't comply, you'll be hit with tariffs on your exports of some other product to Mexico. It's not ideal, and it leads more tariffs, and us pro-trade people are generally against tariffs, but it has generally worked pretty well, and alternatives are hard to come by. I mean, you can try to fine a government who doesn't comply and say, oh, well, now you have to pay, $100 million. How are you going to collect it? There's not a good mechanism for collecting fines from governments if they don't want to pay. So this authorization to retaliate through tariffs that are, that have been endorsed by the WTO system, that is the enforcement mechanism. And generally, over the years, I mean, it's not perfect. It's hard to come up with a measurement of how effective it's been, but I think most people would say it's a pretty effective way of inducing governments to comply with rulings against them. It takes a while. It's not going to happen right away. No, absolutely. And you could make it, you could give the governments less time. You could say you have to comply immediately. But I mean, we all know how governments work. I mean, it's hard to act immediately. I mean, you can do it in an emergency, but to strike the right balance, the rules say you get a reasonable period of time to comply, and it varies between 6 months to maybe 15 months or 2 years. It kind of depends on how complicated it is. Is it a legislative measure that you have to repeal, or is it sort of an executive action that would be a quicker fix? And in this case with Costa Rica, I think it could be a quicker fix, but I mean, I'm not that familiar with the Costa Rican regulatory system, but it seems like it could go quickly, and it seems like they are willing to comply here. They're not going to fight this. That's what it seems like.
I have a comment or maybe a question. I'm not sure for Jim, especially because we focus on the U.S.-Mexico relationship. Of course, trade is political. Yeah, I mean it's a fact. What I'm afraid, though, is that by putting together the words, well, trade is political, we're conflating a number of issues and in some ways hiding others. For example, between the U.S. and Mexico, I think, trade works. We've seen it work, and we've seen it produce wealth and prosperity. Also, a lot of suffering on the border. You're very familiar with the border, but trade is better than no trade, or orderly, legal, well-organized, well-governed trade is better. While I coincide with you that I think that trade is often blamed or perhaps oversold, as you mentioned, but it is also blamed. And so, to me, the problem is not that trade is political or that trade is guilty or not guilty of causing these or that dislocation, but that it is also made political. And so what we have in Trump or what we have in López Obrador in Mexico is two leaders who are more than willing to also undersell trade and blame trade for their own faults. And so I think perhaps we have to be kind of cautious when we hear a politician address trade, because we always have to ask what's behind their motivation in blaming trade, when trade could be potentially quite beneficial for people and companies and investment and the economy. And so I think there's a little bit more to unpack here, and I wonder if you can just, kind of open that box a little bit more, and instead of just simply say, well, trade is political, sort of figure out what are the mechanisms by which trade becomes political. And I'll say that also in the context, and I'd like to get your comment. Mexico is currently, or at least the administration, the López Obrador administration, going in the wrong direction in a number of issues when it comes to trade. The U.S. has been patient, I think, with Mexico for the last 2-3 years, and yet I think the U.S. government is now preparing to take action against Mexico on a number of trade issues. It was announced just yesterday or today. I just read it today. So the U.S. is getting ready because it's saying, look, you're endangering investment. You're not providing the certainty that you're supposed to provide. You're not addressing other structural issues in Mexico, like human rights, women disappearing, the levels of violence and things like that. So in some ways, trade can also be a good political instrument to shed light on some other issues. So I don't see that necessarily as wrong, especially when you have, for example, on the issue of human rights or violence or crime or drug trafficking or whatever, you have 20 women being killed and disappearing every day, and the U.S. has been pointing out that Mexico needs to do something about that. And so saying, hey, if you don't begin to get the rule of law in place and get the right institutions, then there's going to be sanctions. And of course, they're going to have to come through a good excuse through trade. But it's a good political instrument if used right. So I don't think it's necessarily a dirty thing. So I wonder if you can just sort of open that up a little bit more.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I agree with your sentiment completely. And so let me rephrase. Trade is political, but it's not only political. There are other aspects to it, clearly. Partly the reason I wanted to frame it as political was because I think we tend to talk about it too much as if, well, we're going to promote trade and this is for the best of everybody, and it's really because we're concerned about national welfare and we want to improve living standards, and so that's all that we're really doing here. When in fact there are these other motives which are quite strong and quite important in the promotion of trade, and I think we need to, as social scientists, I feel like we need to be aware of that and we need to be honest about those things. And so when I said that we've oversold the importance of trade, that's true in both senses. So that means if you're pro-trade, you tend to think that it creates a whole bunch of benefits that aren't necessarily there. And if you're anti-trade, you tend to think that it creates a whole bunch of harm that's not necessarily there. That's part of the overselling of trade. And, you know, in fact, in terms of national welfare, other types of policies are far more important than trade. And that's part of what I was trying to make with that point, is that things like macroeconomic policies, fiscal and monetary policies, labor market policies, these are far more important in terms of determining national welfare than trade policy is. That's true for most countries on the face of the planet. And clearly, that's true for the U.S. Okay, not to say it's not important. That is not to say trade is not important, but it's not as important as these other things. So this brings up then, you raise a really interesting issue, I think, which is something worth thinking about. And I sense that economists have changed our stance on this issue of using trade policies as a remedy for broader social and economic problems, right? So, and this came up a little bit earlier in the discussion about decarbonizing the economy, right? So we have to do that. I mean, one way or another, we have to figure out how to do that, right? So is trade policy a vehicle for encouraging that? Economists clearly 20 years ago, the consensus would have been, if you want to decarbonize the economy, but don't mess around with trade as a way to do that. Go directly to the source of the problem. There is this sense in public policy that if you have a problem, the most efficient way to solve the problem is go to the source of the problem. Don't mess around with trade and hope that that has an effect over here that solves your problem, right? So, okay, so there's an efficiency argument for not using trade. Right. And there's another argument, which is that, it gets real hazy, sort of the line between protectionism and an actual remedy of a serious problem. Where is that boundary? That gets sometimes difficult to define. So economists have been, I think, historically, until fairly recently, when I believe opinion is beginning to shift within the economics profession, at least that's my opinion, have been opposed to using trade remedies to solve things like, working conditions, in factories. That's a labor market problem, not a trade problem. Or environmental pollution. That's an environmental policy problem. That's not a trade problem, right? I think that's shifting. And I think it's, if I were to ask myself, why is that shifting? It's because it's gotten, we're getting to the edge with climate change, and there's just a sense that we need to act, and we need to somehow forge a broader global consensus on this issue, and we need to use whatever remedies might be available, even if they might have some efficiency reducing effects elsewhere in the economy. Personally, I'm sort of skeptic on all of this, or agnostic, I should. Should we use trade remedies? I think we're going to. I think we do to some extent already. And I think that will be an increasing element of our trade policies. We see with the USMCA, Elizabeth Trujillo was talking about this yesterday, how it has incorporated directly into the agreement trade remedies for environmental issues, for addressing environmental issues. That's a step forward. With the NAFTA agreement, the environmental issues were all in the side agreement. They weren't inside of the NAFTA itself. Right. So this is the direction of change, and is it? You have to decide for yourself what you think about that. If it's a good thing or not. I'm agnostic. It just is. It's happening. It could be a good thing. I agree with you, Tony. It also could be a vehicle for other types of protectionism, though. And so we just have to think about that and look at it case by case, perhaps.
I'd like to follow up on this somewhat irregular chain by asking Guillermo a question. Tony mentioned briefly that the U.S. was considering taking some certain steps, and I think Guillermo has more information. What I would like to ask is, assuming that the U.S. is going to pursue a state-to-state dispute settlement case, which, as Simon said, is a lot more efficient than it used to be, and there's no WTO, so there's not a lot of options. How is it going to affect U.S.-Mexico relations, and do you think it will have any effect on solving the problem?
That's the million-dollar question, David. So we don't know yet the contents of what the USTR is thinking about and which chapter they're going to allege that Mexico breached. The report that came out this morning is that it has to do with the energy policies implemented in Mexico. I can spend a lot of time talking about those particular policies, but it's still unclear whether they're going to remain in place down the line. But clearly there's a lot of uncertainty of what is going to happen in the energy sector, and that is already having an impact on investors. The investors could potentially bring claims directly. I mean, they still have, especially they are considered government contracts covered under the USMCA, under Annex E, so they could actually potentially bring the claims themselves. I think companies in general have felt that they want to wait to see what happens. Just because ISDS has become, this is investor-state dispute resolution mechanism, especially arbitration, they take so long to get resolved. I'm actually working on a paper right now that is tracking down the timelines in Latin America. And you see that the average time for an ISDS claim in the energy sector in Latin America is taking up to 7 years, compared to the regular claims that take 4 years and a half. And those cases where the investors have won, it reaches up to 8 to 9 years. And that is just from the date of filing to the date the award comes out. So if you're an investor in the energy sector in Mexico, you're thinking, do I really want to wait 9 years to get my money on this particular project, or I sit down and try to renegotiate with the government? Now, how the claim between the states, I mean, the United States and Mexico, going to impact those claims? We don't know. I think this is going to be the first time. If they allege Chapter 14, I mean, they go try to allege protection of the investors, and that's going to be a state-to-state panel. That is going to be actually an innovation. I mean, there are I cannot even think of one single case brought by a state against another state for investors' rights, alleging investors' rights. I mean, you have to go all the way back to previous, before the VITs were signed, when states used to espouse those claims. Now, the risk there is, if a state espouses your rights as an investor, there's always a room for negotiation. And so whether the U.S. government is willing to negotiate with Mexico some sort of compensation, and whether the investors are going to be happy with that compensation is up in the air. So I don't know if that's going to solve the problem. I think López Obrador still is willing to keep pushing forward any policies. If the ISDS mechanism is imposed, I think the government is still going to move forward for these same reasons. They think that another administration will have to pay for whatever mistakes AMLO commits today, and that is up for new administrations to figure that out. So they're going to push forward with it. Now, the advantages of a state-to-state panel, as Simon rightly mentioned, is that then the U.S. could potentially put tariffs on Mexico if they find that Mexico actually breached other chapters in the USMCA. Now, that could have a direct impact on this administration. I don't know whether that is going to change their mind or whether they're willing to pay the price.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I don't know, Simon, my memory seems to say that in the U.S.-Ecuador bilateral investment treaty, there was an effort at one point to do state-to-state arbitration on some matter of interpretation, but I don't remember I don't think it actually happened. Did you remember this?
I don't remember.
All right. Let's shift to other topics. Any other questions at the moment from the audience? Yes, good. Please go ahead.
It's been an interesting morning. I've heard several things that suggest that globalization is probably a very attractive thing, and several things that say globalization is probably a very unattractive thing. And I guess I've heard a lot that questions the validity of international treaties. WTO, by any measure, is an international treaty. If you look at the controversy that's going on in the South China Sea, there are violations of an international treaty. More recently, if you look at what's going on in Ukraine, that's violation of an international treaty. We have all of these international treaties including trade treaties that seem to be unenforceable because they encompass such a large group of sovereign nations, and I will point out the word sovereign, who don't necessarily have to agree with the terms of the treaty they've signed. So what are we really talking about when we talk about international trade other than when it is on a bilateral basis?
Oh, sure. I think that so this gets into, I think, political science questions that I've dipped my toe into but don't know that well. I mean, governments. It seems to me that governments are still the main source of power in the world. National governments. So you have a national government, you have sub-federal governments, but the national government has the most power. International organizations are designed to help governments cooperate and maybe to moderate that power to some extent. But the governments still have full control over how much power that they've given out and if they want to take it back. So they can sign a treaty and then they can decide, well, we don't want to comply with it. And the enforcement mechanisms are weak, clearly. In my view, the trade enforcement mechanisms tend to be better, more enforceable than in other areas. So trade has traditionally, historically, had some degree of enforceability, and the WTO has been pretty good in that regard. We've seen over the past couple of years that has been undermined by the United States. As I've said, other countries are working to keep it in place. Now, in the USMCA context and other bilateral and regional contexts, you also have this same enforcement mechanism for trade agreements, and it has worked to varying degrees as well. So as we were saying, NAFTA, it started out working and then it fell apart. We have it back with USMCA. We have this proliferation, hundreds of other trade agreements out there, all with enforcement mechanisms, but they're rarely used. So on paper, they also look like they could work, but they haven't been used. I guess my general take on this is that, and I think this goes along with what Jim says, we shouldn't exaggerate the importance of all these trade agreements and the role of trade in our lives in society. It's important. It has a real impact, but we shouldn't worry about and we shouldn't praise these trade agreements as sort of changing the world and forcing governments to comply. They can't do that much. They can do a little. They can induce, they can encourage, but ultimately the power is with the governments to comply or not. And if they've decided they're not, even after they sign the treaty, there's not much we can do about it. And I do think that trade is an area where we've had the most success in moderating government's power, reining in the sovereignty just a tiny bit for purposes that we thought were valuable. But again, there are limits to it, and it's up to governments what they want to do, and they can change their minds at any point. They can withdraw from all of the treaties, which they generally haven't done, or they can just not comply. They can just ignore them. And we go through sort of waves and periods of this. We had a whole series of bilateral trade agreements in the 1930s that just got forgotten and sort of incorporated into the GATT. I mean, maybe we're on the verge of revising the whole system and moving to a new form of trade governance. I don't think we are, but certainly we could. If that's what governments want to do, if they can figure out a way forward, we could go. They could take us in a new direction. Can I add something? Sure.
Yeah, and I would also add that we pay a lot of attention to when the trade agreements fail, because that stands out. But we don't really think about the successes because they're not noticeable, because everything is functioning as we expect. So let me give you an example, a concrete example. When you join the WTO, you bind your tariffs, which is a commitment not to raise your tariffs above a certain level. That's something that we learned from the Great Depression, when everybody thought they could improve their circumstances by blocking imports, and so everybody blocked imports, so everybody lost their export markets, and it contributed to the Great Depression. It didn't cause it, but it contributed to it, made us much worse off. In 2008-9, because of the tariff bindings that governments had signed, that they were committed to in the WTO, trade did not break down like it might have. There were some problems, but it mostly sailed through that global financial crisis in a pretty good way without being destroyed as it was in the 1930s, and that contributed to global welfare. That was a positive thing. That was something that worked, but it didn't call everybody's attention to it because it was just working like it was supposed to, rather than a failure, which sort of stares us in the face.
And just to build on that just quickly, yes, and to put some fake numbers here, just estimates. So let's say we have 99.9% compliance with these tariff bindings. Nobody talks about that. They talk about the 0.1%, Costa Rica banning the imports of the Mexican avocados. That's the one we talk about. But there's 99.9% of the time, everyone's complying with the agreements, and it just doesn't get talked about.
I'd like to, while we're on this topic, I wanted to ask Simon a question, which is with respect to the U.S. opposition to the appellate body and its crippling of the appellate body. Now that the United States has appointed a USTR, the ambassador, to the WTO, so that there's someone actually in the office now, could, say, the EU, which is been leading the efforts to find an alternative through the MPIAA, could the EU, which has lots of trade disputes from the United States, and so there are many concessions that the United States would like from the EU that the EU could offer. Could the EU, along with China, which has many trade disputes with the United States and has many concessions that it could offer to the United States, and maybe Japan, maybe somebody like Japan too, could they stage something like, an intervention or something like that, where they knock on the door of the USTR, she opens the door, and there's 3, countries standing there and saying, we need to talk. And they come in and they say, here's some, concessions. And do you think something like that might work, that powerful countries like the EU and China and Japan with a lot to offer the United States could actually, just that small group, approach the United States and say, come to the table, we have something to offer, let's talk? Could that possibly work?
That's the ideal, and I haven't been a trade negotiator myself, but that's how I imagine these things work. And yes, everybody wants something from each other. The U.S., I think, is sort of ambivalent about WTO dispute settlement. Isn't really eager to give anything on this, but they know that others want. That others really, this is important to them, so they would like to have WTO dispute settlement working again. So the U.S. must then, I would think, go through the list of things it wants from the EU, from China, from Japan. It wants a lot from China. And yeah, if somebody can put together a package, and this doesn't have to be a Uruguay round type deal, it's a little more informal than that, but if somebody can put together a package of the 5 or 6 items that we can put all together at once and make concessions and trade-offs, that's how I picture it. But you would have to get a real trade negotiator in the room to explain, is there actually a knock at the door, or do we send texts these days?
Morning, guys. Thanks. There is some talk of letting the Section 301 tariffs expire later this year, specifically List 1 and List 2, potentially List 3 and 4. A couple questions surrounding that. Number one, any thoughts on which direction the administration may sway on that? Number two, since it is a topic kind of related to inflation, do we think that there's any impact to inflation if they do let them expire? Number three, if they let them expire, what mechanisms do they entertain to continue to hold China accountable for any kind of open trade issues?
Okay, yeah, I'll start. Okay, so as I understand it, when we get to, after 4 years of having these tariffs in place, there is basically automatically a review triggered if any domestic industry requests it, and they will request it. So I think that in the coming, so USTR just put out a notice yesterday about this. So I think in the coming weeks, we will get definitive notice that a review of the existing tariffs, and there are 2 different stages of them, are going to be undertaken by USTR. So USTR will have the opportunity through that review to rethink all of this and decide which way to go. Which way will they go? I mean, there's a lot to think about there. There are a lot of different players with different views. There's inflation, but then there's just sort of the broader, impact on U.S. companies. I can't make any predictions. I can tell you, and you've probably seen this, you have two members of the administration out there, somebody from the National Security Council and then Secretary of Treasury Yellen, saying, hey, maybe reducing those tariffs would be a good way to fight inflation. And then you have Catherine Tai, the U.S. Trade Representative, when pressed on this by an interviewer grudgingly conceding that perhaps tariffs are on the table, but she really did not seem to want to go in that direction. So figuring out what the Biden administration will do, I mean, I don't think they know. And there's a lot of players, and they're going to fight about it internally. I have no predictions there. So the last part, holding China accountable. My own view of holding China accountable, and I mean, Dan, you may have, I think we probably agree on this. I don't think the Section 301 tariffs have worked very well in regard to holding China accountable for their trade practices, for violations of trade rules. I still believe, I've always believed that the WTO is the best avenue. So for whatever reason, I know there are examples of where China does not comply with international rulings, but for whatever reason, in the trade context, when governments file complaints against China, they've done a pretty good job of complying. I think they respect, at least in the trade setting, a neutral international ruling that they have violated the rules. By contrast, they don't have much respect for a unilateral decision under Section 301 that they've done something bad. To them, that's just U.S. unilateral bullying. They are not eager to look like they're going to cave into bullying. They signed on to the Phase 1 agreement because politically they felt like it was the thing they had to do and it would keep the tariffs in check. But if you want to hold China accountable, I think you really have to go to the WTO. And we've talked about why the WTO dispute settlement system is not working right now. So that's contingent on it actually working. But if your main goal is how do we get China to change its trade practices, hold it accountable for commitments it made, I think that's the only way to go. But I'm happy to hear what Dan has to say if he disagrees or has something to add, or Jim as well.
Go ahead, Dan. Okay, so just with respect to China, China is a big proponent of globalization, and it's a big proponent of the WTO. This was not always the case. But China wants to go through the multilateral route, which is why it does not like unilateral action by the United States. So when the United States takes Special 301 and Section 301 tariffs, that's unilateral action by the United States and China does not react well to that. When China goes through the WTO, that's part of the process of globalization, and China supports the WTO and globalization because, of course, China benefits from globalization. And so that's why China would much rather have these actions go through the WTO. And it's, again, when you say China respects the WTO and doesn't respect unilateral action, well, that's because China wants globalization and does not want to go back to the old system of the most powerful country can push around all other countries. And that's why I think that China would be willing to be one of the group to knock on the door, right? And to say, look, we have this package of concessions, come back to the table and let's get this process working again.
You want to add anything? Yes.
Can I just say one other thing about China? Because Simon and I were talking about this. China actually would like to be friends with the United States, okay? China would rather be friends with the United States than friends with Russia. But China, it's impossible right now for China to be friends with the United States given the U.S. criticism of the Uyghur situation. So that's made it impossible. I think China actually could even accept the status quo as to Taiwan if the United States just kept quiet about it. But with the criticism of the Uyghurs, that's made it impossible, and it's made China into a political enemy. But China doesn't want to be a political enemy. China would like to be friends. And again, would rather be friends with the United States than Russia, but it's been driven into the arms of the, other lover, right? So it's unfortunate, but that's my opinion, is that there's got to be a better way of dealing with China, so that, because China naturally wants to be friends with the United States. That's my opinion.
If China wants to be friends, why can't they find a way to compromise, to treat the Uyghurs like human beings, and to just shift the paradigm regarding Taiwan?
Well, because there's some things that China thinks are even more important than being friends with the United States. And with respect to those two issues, those are core issues. And I've said that China wants to be friends with the United States, but at the same time, it's important to understand is that China is willing to go to war with the United States over those issues. There's no compromise on those issues. So that's the reality. So while China wants to be friends, there's a line where China will go to war with the United States over Taiwan if that ever happens. And that's just the way it is, in my opinion.
At this point, almost any manufacturing company of any size that makes a locational decision makes it on the basis of subsidies. In the United States, those subsidies typically come from the local governments rather than the federal governments. The same is pretty much the case in China. A, do you see any ability to rein this in at the WTO? B, do you see this becoming an issue within NAFTA or within USMCA? As, for example, Mexicans who want to buy electric vehicles from, say, Ford Motor Company discover that all of the electric vehicles available in the market were manufactured in a highly subsidized facility that's been built in Tennessee rather than in Mexico.
I can answer the WTO one. I'll leave the USMCA one to someone else. So, I mean, at the WTO, we have a whole, agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, and so that involves two things. One is some disciplines on subsidies. Basically, if you have subsidies that are contingent on export or use of local content, those are prohibited, just flat out, easy to prove. If you've done something like that, it's against the rules. You also have rules that say if you give subsidies that have adverse effects on your trading partners, I don't want to say they're prohibited because the lawyers wouldn't like that. You can bring a complaint against it. So you have some disciplines at the WTO on subsidies directly. You also have the authorization for governments to impose countervailing duties on subsidized goods subsidized in a foreign country. So normally, you, as we talked about, you've bound your tariffs at a certain level. So you can't impose more than, say, a 2.5% tariff on automobiles. But if those automobiles were subsidized in the foreign country, you can impose extra tariffs on them. So the WTO envisions these two disciplines on subsidies, sort of the multilateral one under WTO rules and then the unilateral one under domestic rules. That offers us some ability to rein in, to discipline subsidies. However, if every government, if governments decide it's that important to give subsidies, they can do it, and the remedy is really just that somebody can impose tariffs in response. And so you get to the point where everybody's imposing subsidies and then imposing tariffs in response, it sort of falls apart. And you see an example of this, I think, with aircraft. So the Europeans famously gave all these subsidies to Airbus. And when confronted with that, and when a WTO complaint was brought, the Europeans said, yes, but you give all these subsidies to Boeing. And this dispute dragged on for about 18 years. And eventually just petered out as the Biden administration said, we give up. We're all just going to give subsidies. So I think the lesson here is there are some disciplines, but there are clearly some limits. And if governments are determined to subsidize, say, the semiconductor industry, which they seem to be, the WTO can't do much about it. We'll end up in sort of a spiral of a subsidy war with some tariff retaliation. That's not great. I wish they wouldn't subsidize, but I understand politically why they do, and there are just limits to what we can accomplish with trade rules here.
On autos, Ford is making the Mustang in Mexico, and among other places. If you can afford it, I don't know. There was a lot of talk during the last fall when the Build Back Better Act was still viable, because it included $12,500 in subsidies to auto companies who produced the EVs in the U.S. Using more than 50% or more U.S. content. and part of that depended on using union labor. The BBBA is, I would say, deader than a doornail. But during that process, I think it became very clear that Canada and Mexico eventually would protest this in dispute settlement under the USMCA, since there isn't any functional one under the WTO. Now, obviously, those subsidies have been abandoned, at least for the time being. But following up on Simon's point, the subsidies, I think, are very clearly, they're illegal under WTO rules because they're specific to they're given to a specific industry. But you're not going to see Korea or Japan or Germany bringing a case because they're going to be subsidizing electrical vehicles as well. Canada and Mexico probably can't afford to do that. So I think they could bring a case at some point in the future if these subsidies are revived in subsequent legislation and if they discriminate against other USMCA produced goods, because the USMCA agreements incorporate the subsidies rules from the WTO. So I thought it was a big possibility back in October. Now it's gone, but I don't think it's totally gone.
I have a question for Simon or Daniel or you, David. But so what about subsidies that originate with local governments, or state governments? Not a national government, but a state or local government.
It's covered at the WTO. I mean, the WTO rules on subnational measures are a little bit tricky, and we don't have a lot of cases. But I think so far, in theory, it's hard to bring a complaint against those kind of federal measures, but in practice, nobody's really contested it. Nobody's tried to exploit what I think is a potential loophole there. So I think that it's covered, I think it's safe to say it's covered just as if it were a federal measure. So some of the Boeing subsidies come from states and from cities, and in the dispute at the WTO over the Boeing subsidies, nobody made a big deal out of that. I thought I would have thought there are opportunities, and maybe they could, but they didn't. So for now, it's sort of like the national security exception we've talked about in the past couple of days. These things can linger on for 30 years, and nobody worries about it, and that's where we are right now. People just understand those are subsidies just like other subsidies. If you want to challenge them, the normal rules apply.
Just to follow up on that, we've seen, of course, it's been around for a long time. Look at South Carolina and BMW. But in the last 6 months, Alabama is subsidizing battery production for Mercedes. Tennessee and Kentucky are both subsidizing battery and battery production for Ford. Nissan is getting battery subsidies in North Carolina, and somebody's getting them recently from the state of Michigan. I think Simon makes a good point. I mean, I suspect this goes on in a lot of other countries. It always surprised me a little bit that somebody at some point didn't bring an action. There's an enormous amount of economic literature in here about what a disaster this is for state governments and state budgets, but it seems to be a way of life, and I don't see it going away with the electric vehicles.
Question, really. When you speak about local subsidies, does that include, I would presume that it does, something so common as a tax incentive to bring, a company to Houston, for example? Happens every day.
Now, I mean, those things aren't prohibited by the rules, but if they had an adverse impact on, a foreign competitor, you have a case there. So if you have a tax incentive that's tied to the use of local content, which sometimes you see, then it's sort of a clear violation. But if it's just, here's some money or here's a tax break, it's covered by the rules, but you have to prove injury, basically. So if you were a foreign government complaining about that, you'd have to show how your company was injured by that, and that's hard to do. I mean, you have to hire a team of economists who can, run through some economic models and actually demonstrate that. And so it's not an easy case to bring, but in theory, yes, those can be challenged.
So, given the current border dispute, we have Texas to Mexico regarding the shutdown of that border for trade. does either the USMCA or the WTO have a mechanism that would, since we're talking about states in this regard, rather the regional states in this regard, is there a mechanism that can deal with something like that, where it's not a paid benefit, but it's actually a blocking of trade between the groups?
I'll start and then Guillermo. The argument presumably that, why don't you do it, Guillermo? I don't know. National security is the defense, but I don't know whether Texas can invoke that separately from the U.S.
So that is a great question. I mean, it depends on how it's framed. I think the governor is framing it under security issue, right? It has to do with the migrants. The first time we saw Governor Abbott also blocking trade with Mexico was when the blackout happened a year ago. So you remember he issued the rule to block all the exports of natural gas out of the state. Now there's still a lot of questions of whether how much actually was halted or whether it was Mexico's fault as well, because they didn't want to pay the high price of the gas at that point. There's a whole issue about the contracts. But it's not the first time that the governor has argued security concerns when it comes to trade. The USMCA does contemplate an essential security exception. Now, the big question is domestically whether a state governor can actually argue it. Usually it would be the federal government arguing the exception. We never got the chance to test that issue domestically, the constitutional question of a governor actually imposing some sort of trade restriction. That, to me, it would be completely unconstitutional domestically. So you would have to start there. If, let's say, the thing moves on, it will be an interesting question whether they could actually impose it. I've heard today Mexico, for example, they announced, Marcelo Ebrard, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, is right now in Washington, and they announced that they're going to be steering trade to New Mexico to avoid going through Texas. And they are expanding the capacity of the crossing points in New Mexico as a way to punish the governor of Texas. Now, I know that the governor of Nuevo León was here. I don't know if you had the chance to meet him, like literally last week, and bragging about the expansion of the Colombia trading, the bridge. So what is happening, what we're seeing right now is an interesting development where local governments are taking a more active stand when it comes to trade policy. And even we heard a couple of days ago also even the UK talked about signing MOUs with different states in the United States to foster more trade between the UK and those states. So how all these things are going to play out is going to be very interesting. But at least constitutionally speaking, it seems to me, I'm not a US constitutional law scholar, but it seems to me that it is very clear that trade policies is set up by the federal government and not particularly by state authorities. So,
anyone else?
Well, I think we're just about on time. So let me thank you for coming today. As we mentioned, we had this great workshop yesterday. We discussed a lot of issues. That will produce a series of white papers that will eventually come out. And so I thank you, and I thank those online. There were a number of people connected online as well. We're doing this hybrid event thing, so we'll see how that works. We're trying that out. And I want to thank our keynote, Marc Levinson, and of course there's books in the back, and he's here to sign them if you would like to have some summer reading. And I also want to thank our panelists, Simon, James, and Daniel, and of course David Gantz for being in the panel this morning. We put out a table with some snacks and tea to encourage you to stay for a few more minutes to network, get to know each other, and discuss further these issues among ourselves. So thank you again for being here this morning, and have a good day.